The bright morning sun streamed through the airport windows as a 12-year-old boy clutched his backpack straps, trying to contain his excitement. This was his first time flying alone, and not just in any seat. His parents had saved up to get him a first-class ticket as a special treat for his straight A's. His mom had spent the previous evening making sure everything was perfect. His documents were neatly organized in a clear folder. His favorite blue hoodie was freshly washed, and his phone was fully charged to call his grandmother as soon as he landed in Atlanta. Walking through the terminal, he remembered his dad's words. Stand tall, be polite, and remember, you deserve to be there, just like everyone else. The boy had nodded seriously, though he didn't fully understand why his dad seemed so concerned. Now, as he approached the gate with his unaccompanied minor badge proudly displayed, he noticed how some people did a double take at his presence. A kind gate agent checked his documents, gave him a warm smile, and handed him his boarding pass. "You're all set. We'll make sure you have a wonderful flight," she said, patting his shoulder. The boy felt his confidence grow. This wasn't so scary after all. That feeling didn't last long. As he stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant's welcoming smile vanished the moment their eyes met. Her face twisted into what the boy would later describe to his parents as the same look people get when they smell old milk. She stepped forward, blocking his path to the first-class cabin. "I think you must be confused," she said loudly, making several passengers turn their heads. "First class is this way. Your seat must be back there." She pointed toward the economy section without even glancing at his boarding pass. The boy took a deep breath, just like his mom had taught him when dealing with difficult situations. "No, ma'am," he said politely, holding out his boarding pass. "I have seat 2A. My parents got it for me as a special treat." The flight attendant snatched the boarding pass from his hand, examining it like she was checking for counterfeit money. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And where are your parents?" she asked, her tone making it clear she didn't believe this could be right. "I'm an unaccompanied minor," he explained, pointing to his badge. "All my documents are right here." He reached for the clear folder his mom had prepared, but the flight attendant waved it away. "Let me check something," she said sharply, walking away with his boarding pass still in her hand. The boy stood awkwardly in the aisle, feeling the stares of other passengers burning into his back. An elderly woman in the front row caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic smile. A businesswoman seated nearby spoke up, "Young man, would you like me to help you? I saw your boarding pass clearly showed this section." But before the boy could respond, the flight attendant returned with another crew member. "There seems to be some confusion about your seating assignment," she announced loudly, despite the crystal-clear documentation showing otherwise. "We need to ensure everything is appropriate for our first-class standards." The boy felt his throat tighten. He thought about calling his mom, but he didn't want her to worry. He was a big kid now. He could handle this. Still, as he stood there with other passengers now openly watching the scene unfold, he couldn't help but think about his dad's words again. He did deserve to be there, right? So why did this flight attendant seem so determined to prove otherwise? Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of an incident that would soon capture national attention and spark a much-needed conversation about treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or appearance. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as the flight attendant continued her interrogation. More passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. The boy stood quietly, his hands starting to sweat around the straps of his backpack. He'd been so excited about this trip just minutes ago, but now his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. "I need to see your documents again," the flight attendant demanded, even though she'd already checked them twice. Her voice carried that fake sweetness that grown-ups sometimes use when they're trying to sound nice but really aren't. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The boy pulled out his clear folder, his hands slightly shaking. "Here's everything," he said softly. "My mom made sure I had all the right papers." He could almost hear his mother's voice reminding him to stay calm and respectful, no matter what. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, frowning at the scene. "Excuse me," he called out, "but I've been watching this whole thing, and I don't understand the problem." The young man has shown his boarding pass multiple times. The flight attendant's face tightened. "Sir, I'm simply following protocol," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. She flipped through the boy's documents again, making a show of scrutinizing each page. "We have certain standards in first class." A woman a few rows back had already pulled out her phone and was quietly recording the situation. Others were starting to whisper among themselves. The boy could catch bits of their conversations. "This isn't right," and "poor kid," and "someone should do something." The elderly lady who had smiled at him earlier spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Young man, what's your seat number again?" When the boy answered 2A, she pointed to the empty seat next to her. "That's right here, dear. Right where your boarding pass says it should be." But the flight attendant wasn't done. She crossed her arms and looked down at the boy. "I'm going to need to speak with the lead flight attendant about this situation." The way she said "situation" made it sound like the boy had done something terribly wrong, when all he'd done was try to sit in the seat his parents had bought for him. Other passengers were becoming visibly upset now. A man in a business suit stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I fly first class every week, and I've never seen anyone treated this way. The child has every right to be here." The boy felt tears pricking at his eyes but held them back. He didn't want to cry in front of everyone. He thought about his dad's proud face when they'd bought the ticket, how his mom had hugged him extra tight at security, promising everything would be fine. He wished they were here now. The flight attendant's walkie-talkie crackled as she called for backup. "We have a situation in first class," she said, glancing at the boy like he was causing some huge problem. More phones were out now, recording everything. The boy couldn't help but notice how the flight attendant's hands were shaking slightly too, but not from fear, from anger. A young woman sitting nearby leaned over and whispered to the boy, "Don't worry, we're all watching, and we're not going to let anything unfair happen." Her words helped a little, but the boy still felt his heart pounding. He'd never been the center of so much attention before, and definitely not this kind of attention. The lead flight attendant was now making his way up the aisle. The boy clutched his backpack tighter, wondering what would happen next. His excitement about flying first class, about surprising his grandmother, about having this big adventure on his own. It was all disappearing under the weight of this moment. But he had no idea that this was about to become much bigger than just one flight, one seat, or one boy trying to take a trip to visit his grandmother. The lead flight attendant arrived at the scene, his face showing confusion as he took in the situation. By now, at least half a dozen passengers had their phones out, recording everything. The boy stood perfectly still, his boarding pass and documents still clutched tightly in his hands. "What seems to be the problem here?" the lead flight attendant asked, looking between his colleague and the young passenger. Before the first flight attendant could answer, several passengers spoke up at once. "This child has been treated horribly," the elderly woman said, her voice trembling with anger. "He has every right to be in first class, and your colleague has been questioning him nonstop." The first flight attendant cut in quickly, her voice sharp. "He's an unaccompanied minor, and I'm just making sure everything is in order. It's unusual to have someone so young in first class without an adult." She emphasized the word unusual in a way that made several passengers shake their heads in disapproval. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was now standing. "I've been watching this whole thing," he said firmly. "This young man has shown his documents 3 times already. He's been nothing but polite while being harassed for no good reason." The boy felt a mix of emotions he'd never experienced before. He was embarrassed to be the center of attention, grateful for the kind passengers speaking up for him, and confused about why this was happening at all. His parents had taught him to be proud of who he was, but right now, he just wished he could disappear. Look, the first flight attendant said to her supervisor, "I'm concerned about maintaining our first-class standards. Perhaps we should." Standards? A woman 2 rows back interrupted loudly. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and the only person disrupting any standards here is you." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. The lead flight attendant looked increasingly uncomfortable as he reviewed the boy's documentation. Everything was perfectly in order. The first-class ticket, the unaccompanied minor forms, all signed and properly processed. "I can see everything is in order here," he began, but his colleague wasn't done. "He's being disruptive," she suddenly declared, though everyone had seen the boy standing quietly the whole time. "I don't feel comfortable having him in my section of the cabin." The passengers erupted in protests. "The only person being disruptive is you," someone called out. The young woman who had been quietly recording everything stood up. "I'm a social media manager," she announced, "and I want everyone to know I've been recording this entire incident. This kind of treatment is completely unacceptable." The boy felt his phone vibrate in his pocket, probably his mom checking if he boarded okay. His heart sank, knowing he'd have to tell her what was happening. He'd been so excited about proving he could travel alone, and now this was turning into something he never expected. The first flight attendant's face had turned red, but instead of backing down, she seemed to get more determined. "For the safety of everyone involved," she said loudly, "I think we need to have this passenger removed and rebooked on another flight." The cabin erupted in outrage. "Safety. He's a child. This is discrimination. I'm calling corporate right now." Phones were dialing, passengers were standing, and the lead flight attendant looked completely overwhelmed. Through it all, the boy remained quiet, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in tough situations. But inside, his mind was racing. Would they really kick him off the plane? What would he tell his grandmother, who was already on her way to pick him up? How had his dream trip turned into this nightmare? The situation had reached a boiling point, and everyone knew something had to give. What nobody realized was that in the next few minutes, a decision would be made that would not only change this boy's life, but would spark a nationwide conversation about treating all passengers with dignity and respect. What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times in the coming days. The first flight attendant, her face now flushed with anger, made a decision that would ultimately cost her her career. She reached for her radio and called security to the gate. "I need assistance removing a disruptive passenger from first class," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief, and his hands started trembling. He'd never been called disruptive in his life. His teachers always praised him for being one of the quietest students in class. The elderly woman next to him immediately pressed her call button. "I'm calling for another flight attendant too," she declared firmly. "What's happening here is completely wrong, and I won't sit quietly while it happens." The businessman who had defended the boy earlier was now on his phone. "Yes, I'd like to speak to your corporate office immediately," he said loudly. "I'm witnessing something on Flight 2317 that your PR team needs to know about right now." 2 gate agents appeared at the entrance of the plane, looking confused. The lead flight attendant tried to regain control of the situation. "Wait, I don't think we need to," but his colleague cut him off. "This passenger needs to be removed," she insisted, pointing at the boy who was still standing quietly, his backpack clutched to his chest. "He's causing a disturbance in first class." "The only disturbance here is you," shouted a passenger from the back who had gotten up to see what was happening. More phones were recording now, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. The boy finally spoke up, his voice small but clear. "Can I please call my mom?" he asked. "She's a doctor, and she helped me arrange everything for this flight." But before anyone could respond, the first flight attendant stepped between him and the other passengers. Please escort this passenger off the plane, she told the gate agents. We can rebook him on another flight. The way she said it made it sound like she was doing him a favor, but everyone could see the truth. The cabin erupted in chaos. Several passengers stood up, declaring they would leave the flight in protest if the boy was removed. Others were already posting videos online, their fingers flying over their phones as they typed out what they were witnessing. The Yum social media manager who had been recording everything announced, "This video is going viral right now. People are already sharing it and tagging the airline." She turned to the flight attendant. "Is this really how you want to be remembered? For removing a well-behaved child from a flight just because you don't think he belongs in first class?" The gate agents looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, knelt down beside the boy. "Son, can you show me your boarding pass and documents?" he asked gently. The boy handed over his clear folder with trembling hands. As the gate agent reviewed the documents, the first flight attendant continued her protests, but her voice was now drowned out by the other passengers. The elderly woman had her arm around the boy's shoulders, telling him none of this was his fault. The businessman was still on his phone with corporate, describing the scene in detail. The boy finally got out his phone and dialed his mom's number. As it rang, he could hear the lead flight attendant trying to reason with his colleague, telling her she needed to stand down. But she wouldn't listen. She stood there, arms crossed, watching as the situation she had created spiraled completely out of her control. What none of them knew was that this moment, captured on dozens of phones from multiple angles, would be the turning point. By the time the boy's mother answered his call, the first videos were already gaining thousands of views online, and the airline's corporate office was about to make a decision that would change everything. The moment the boy's mother answered his phone call, everything changed. Her voice came through clear and strong on speakerphone, filling the tense cabin air. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" she asked, immediately sensing something wasn't right. Before the boy could answer, the elderly woman sitting next to him gently took the phone. "Ma'am, I think you need to know what's happening to your son right now," she said, her voice steady but angry. "I'm a grandmother myself, and I've never seen anything like this." As the elderly woman explained the situation, the boy's mother listened in growing disbelief. The first flight attendant tried to interrupt, but the businessman who'd been on the phone with corporate stepped between them. "The boy's mother is a doctor," he announced loudly. "Let's see how this plays out on the news tonight." The social media manager stood up again, her phone still recording. "Your son's story is already trending," she told the boy's mother through the phone. "The videos have over 10,000 shares in just the last few minutes. People are outraged." The flight was now delayed by 15 minutes, and passengers in economy were craning their necks to see what was happening. The first flight attendant's face had gone from red to pale as she realized just how badly she had mishandled the situation. "Dr. Thompson," the lead flight attendant said, finally addressing the boy's mother properly through the phone, "I want to assure you that your son has done absolutely nothing wrong. All his documentation is perfect." But the boy's mother wasn't having any of it. Her voice was controlled but powerful as it came through the speaker. "I want the names of everyone involved in this incident. My son has been humiliated for no reason other than—" She paused, and everyone knew exactly what she meant without her having to say it. The gate agent, who had been reviewing the documents, straightened up. "Ma'am," he said toward the phone, "I've reviewed everything. Your son has every right to be on this flight, in this seat. The only question now is whether the flight attendant who caused this situation should be the one to leave." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The first flight attendant's hands started to shake as she realized her job might be on the line. "I was just following protocol," she tried to explain, but several passengers scoffed. "What protocol?" asked the social media manager. "The protocol of judging a child by his appearance. The whole world is watching this now. My last video has over 50,000 views already." The boy's mother was still on speakerphone, her voice now addressing everyone in the cabin. "I want to thank all of you who stood up for my son," she said. "And to those who recorded this incident. Thank you for making sure the truth comes out." The lead flight attendant's radio crackled. A voice came through, asking him to step outside for a moment. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was grim. "Corporate is aware of the situation," he announced. "They've made their decision." The boy, who had been quiet through all of this, finally looked up. Despite everything, there was strength in his eyes, the kind that comes from knowing you've done nothing wrong and that justice is finally about to be served. The first flight attendant seemed to sense what was coming. She took a step back, clutching her hands together. The entire cabin held its breath, waiting to hear what would happen next. The videos were still rolling, capturing every moment of what would soon become one of the most viral stories of the year. Nobody knew it yet, but in the next few minutes, the airline would make a decision that would not only change this flight, but would lead to a complete overhaul of their training policies and set a new standard for how airlines handle discrimination incidents. The airline's corporate decision came swiftly and decisively. The lead flight attendant stepped back into the cabin, his expression serious as he addressed everyone. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for this unfortunate incident," he announced. "The first-class flight attendant will be removed from this flight immediately. She will not be serving any passengers today." A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The first flight attendant's face turned pale as her supervisor asked her to gather her belongings and exit the aircraft. As she walked down the aisle, passengers watched in silence, some still recording with their phones. The boy's mother was still on speakerphone. "Is my son okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The elderly woman sitting next to the boy patted his hand gently. "He's been so brave," she said into the phone. "You should be very proud of him." The social media manager stood up again, her phone now showing even more staggering numbers. "The story has reached over 500,000 views," she announced. "People are calling for a complete investigation of the airline's training procedures. This is becoming much bigger than just one incident." The gate agent who had been so kind earlier approached the boy with a tablet in hand. "Young man, the airline would like to offer you an upgrade to our premium first-class service for all your future flights this year," he said warmly. "And your grandmother will be met at the arrival gate by our customer service team to explain everything." The businessman who had been on the phone with corporate earlier nodded approvingly. "It's a start," he said, "but this needs to be a wake-up call for the entire industry." The boy finally sat down in his seat, the one that had been rightfully his all along. His hands had stopped shaking, and some of the color had returned to his face. The elderly woman beside him offered him a piece of chocolate from her purse. "Sometimes sweet things help after tough moments," she said with a grandmotherly smile. Through the phone, they could hear the boy's mother typing on a computer. "I'm documenting everything," she said. "This isn't just about one flight or one incident. This is about making sure no other child ever has to go through something like this again." The lead flight attendant returned with a new crew member, a friendly-faced woman who immediately approached the boy. "I'll be taking care of you today," she said warmly. "And I want you to know that what happened earlier does not represent who we are as an airline." Other passengers began sharing their contact information, offering to be witnesses if needed. The young social media manager showed the boy some of the supportive comments flooding in from around the world. "Look," she said, "thousands of people are standing with you." The original flight attendant's actions had backfired completely. Instead of removing the boy from first class, she had lost her position and sparked a movement. The airline's phone lines were now flooded with calls from reporters wanting to know more about the incident. As the new flight attendant began the pre-flight service, bringing the boy a special hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, his mother made one final statement over the phone. "This is how change happens," she said, her voice clear and strong. "When people stand up together against injustice, even in small moments like this, It creates ripples that can transform entire systems. The plane was finally ready for takeoff, nearly an hour behind schedule. But nobody seemed to mind the delay. They had all been part of something important, a moment when ordinary people chose to stand up for what was right. As the aircraft began to move, the boy looked out his window, knowing that his story would help ensure a better future for other young travelers. Back in the terminal, the airline's management was already drafting a company-wide memo about immediate changes to their training programs. They had no choice. The incident was now viral, and the world was watching to see how they would respond. By the time the plane landed in Atlanta, the incident had exploded across every social media platform. The airline's corporate office was in full crisis management mode, and their response would prove to be a turning point in how airlines handle discrimination cases. The boy's grandmother was waiting at the gate, just as promised, accompanied by two senior airline representatives. Her eyes were wet with tears as she hugged her grandson, but they were tears of pride, not sadness. "You stood your ground with such dignity," she whispered to him. The airline's regional director stepped forward, holding a formal letter of apology. "Ma'am," he addressed the grandmother, "your grandson's experience has opened our eyes to serious issues in our training program. We're making immediate changes." Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. The videos of the incident had reached millions of views across different platforms. Major news networks were running the story in their headline segments. The airline's CEO made a public statement that afternoon. "What happened today goes against everything we stand for. We're not just apologizing. We're taking action. Effective immediately, we're launching a comprehensive review of our training procedures and implementing mandatory monthly sensitivity training for all staff." The former flight attendant's story took an unexpected turn too. Local news reporters discovered this wasn't her first incident of discriminatory behavior. Previous complaints had been filed, but never properly addressed. Now those old reports were coming to light, forcing other airlines to examine their own complaint handling procedures. The kind businessman from the flight appeared on a morning news show. "What struck me most," he said, "wasn't just the discrimination. It was how one young boy's dignity in the face of unfair treatment inspired an entire plane full of strangers to stand up for what's right." The social media manager's videos continued to gain traction. She created a follow-up post explaining how the other passengers had united to support the boy. "This wasn't just about one incident," she wrote. "It was about people saying enough is enough to everyday discrimination." The airline's new training program was announced within days. It would include real-world scenarios, cultural sensitivity workshops, and most importantly, clear procedures for reporting and addressing discriminatory behavior. Other airlines began announcing similar initiatives, not wanting to risk similar incidents. The elderly woman who had sat next to the boy wrote a letter to the local newspaper. "In my 70 years of flying," she wrote, "I've never been prouder to be a passenger. That young man showed more grace under pressure than most adults I know." Back home, the boy's mother was receiving messages from parents across the country, sharing similar stories and thanking her family for bringing this issue to light. Parent groups began organizing to create guidelines for airlines about how to properly treat young passengers traveling alone. The airline's human resources department was flooded with applications from people wanting to be part of their new, improved training team. "We want to turn this negative incident into a positive change for the industry," the HR director told reporters. Professional flight attendant associations released statements condemning discrimination and announcing their own initiatives to support better training. "One person's actions shouldn't tarnish our entire profession," their spokesperson said. "Most of us got into this job because we love helping people." As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just about one flight, one boy, or one airline. It was about something much bigger: how a moment of injustice, when met with collective action and corporate responsibility, could lead to lasting change. The airline would later report that this incident, though painful, led to the most significant improvements in their company culture in decades. Sometimes they realized it takes a child's courage and a plane full of strangers willing to stand up for what's right to create real change. 1 week after the incident, something remarkable started happening in airports across the country. The story had touched a nerve, and people weren't willing to let it fade away like yesterday's news. Flight crews began noticing passengers being more mindful of each other, speaking up when they saw unfair treatment, and going out of their way to help young travelers. The boy's mother had been invited to speak at a national transportation conference. Standing at the podium, she shared how her son's experience had affected their family. "My boy left for his grandmother's house that day expecting an adventure," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Instead, he became part of a movement for change." Support poured in from unexpected places. A group of retired pilots started a mentorship program for young people interested in aviation careers. "We want every child to know they belong in every part of this industry," their spokesperson announced. "The sky should have no barriers." The airline's new training videos now included real passenger stories. "We're not just teaching rules," explained the training director. "We're teaching humanity." The videos showed how small acts of kindness or prejudice could shape a passenger's entire travel experience. The social media manager who recorded the incident had turned her attention to creating a platform where travelers could share their stories. "Every story matters," she wrote in her blog. "Sometimes it takes just one voice to start a chorus of change." Her website received thousands of submissions in its first month. The businessman who had defended the boy that day started working with his company to change their corporate travel policies. They now specifically chose airlines with strong anti-discrimination training programs. Other companies followed suit, creating a ripple effect across the industry. The elderly woman who had sat next to the boy during the incident began receiving letters from other grandparents. They shared stories of their own grandchildren facing similar situations. She decided to start a support group called Flying with Dignity to help families prepare for solo travel. Even the airport staff noticed changes. Gate agents reported more passengers stopping to help lost children. Flight attendants shared stories of travelers being more patient and understanding with each other. It seemed the incident had reminded everyone that airports weren't just transfer points, they were communities. The boy himself had returned to normal life, but with a new perspective. His teachers noticed he spoke up more in class, especially when he saw other students being treated unfairly. "Sometimes being brave means helping others be brave too," he told his mom one evening. Various civil rights organizations used the incident as a case study in their training materials. They'd highlighted how the collective action of passengers had made a difference. "Change doesn't always come from big protests," one leader explained. "Sometimes it comes from small moments of people doing what's right." The airline industry publications couldn't ignore the story either. Trade magazines ran special issues about customer service and discrimination. Training companies developed new programs focusing on real-world scenarios. The incident had become a turning point in how airlines approached customer relations. The kind gate agent who had helped the boy that day got promoted to lead customer service training. In his new role, he made sure every training session included a simple message. "We're not just moving passengers from point A to point B. We're taking care of people." As weeks passed, more positive stories emerged. A teenage girl wrote about how other passengers stood up for her when she faced similar treatment. A young boy shared how a flight attendant made him feel special on his first solo flight. The ripple effects of that one incident kept spreading. Local schools began inviting airline representatives to speak about careers in aviation, emphasizing that everyone was welcome in the industry. The message was clear: the skies belong to everyone. 1 year after the incident, the boy and his family were invited back to the airline's headquarters for a special ceremony. The company was launching its new comprehensive training center, and they wanted him to cut the ribbon. The same passengers who had stood up for him that day were also invited to attend. The The social media manager's original videos had reached over 50 million views worldwide. She had turned her experience into a successful career, traveling around the country to speak about the power of recording and sharing incidents of injustice. One video changed an entire industry, she often said in her talks. Imagine what else we can change when we work together. The former flight attendant who had caused the incident went through a remarkable transformation herself. After months of reflection and personal growth, she began speaking at industry events about her mistakes and what she had learned. I had to face my own biases, she admitted. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Her honesty in acknowledging her errors earned her respect, even from those who had initially condemned her actions. The elderly woman who had sat next to the boy that day had become something of a celebrity in her retirement community. Her Flying with Dignity support group had grown into a national organization, helping thousands of families navigate solo travel. Sometimes life gives you a chance to stand up for what's right, she told a reporter. When that happens, you must take it. The airline's new training center became a model for the industry. Other airlines sent their staff there to learn about handling difficult situations with compassion and understanding. The kind gate agent who had helped the boy now led these training sessions, sharing the story as a powerful example of what not to do and how to make things right. The boy's mother continued her advocacy work, but with a focus on positive change rather than dwelling on past hurts. She worked with airlines to develop child-friendly policies and procedures. Every child deserves to feel safe and welcome when they travel, she would say. That's not just good business. It's the right thing to do. The businessman who had defended the boy that day noticed changes in his own corporate environment, too. His company had adopted new policies about speaking up against discrimination, inspired by what happened on that flight. Sometimes leadership means standing up for others, he told his employees. At airports across the country, new signs appeared. All passengers welcome here and dignity in flight. These weren't just empty words. They represented real policy changes and commitments to better service. Flight crews reported feeling more empowered to stand up against discrimination, knowing their companies would support them. The boy himself had grown taller and more confident over the year. He still flew to visit his grandmother regularly, but now other young passengers often recognized him. "You're the one who helped change things," they would say. He would just smile and tell them, "We all changed things together." On the anniversary of the incident, the airline announced a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers. They named it the Dignity in Flight Scholarship, and the boy was asked to be on the selection committee. His simple requirement for candidates: they should want to make flying better for everyone. The story had come full circle. What began as a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement of positive change. The airline industry had learned that treating people with dignity wasn't just about following rules. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt welcome. As the boy cut the ribbon at the new training center, surrounded by the same passengers who had supported him a year ago, he said something simple but powerful. Sometimes bad things happen so good things can grow in their place. The crowd applauded, knowing they had all been part of something bigger than themselves. The incident had shown that when people stand together against injustice, real change is possible. It wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about making sure every passenger, young or old, would always feel welcome in the skies.